Welcome back, everyone. We're going to try something a little different this time because I don't have enough footage from the actual flight and the problems that I'm discussing, but I really do feel like the title says it all. Tea leaves actually saved my engine. How does that work? Let's get into it. Back in August, Alila and I took a trip down to Mississippi to visit one of the few operating tea farms in the U.S., the Great Mississippi Tea Company. In fact, my last flight debrief looked at the flight down, and it was predominantly uneventful on a gorgeous VFR day. The one downside to this trip is that it was an absurdly hot weekend. We had one of those heat domes lingering, which caused for some surface temperatures in Mississippi to be in excess of 105 degrees. Now, on the way down, the Columbia was purring along at altitude, hardly aware that the surface was so warm. At 15,000, while well above ISA at that altitude, we were still hovering around 3 or 4 degrees C, cruising around 190 knots on just shy of 15 gallons per hour. Really quite a nice flight. And it turned into an easy arrival and went on to be a great weekend where we learned how to pick fresh tea leaves and process green tea. Then we got to roll and roast and sweat a little bit, making one of the world's oldest drinks. After some sampling and finally cooling ourselves down a bit, we headed back to the airport where things got a little abnormal. When we checked into the FBO, we paid our fuel bill and started to pre-flight the plane. Now when we fly together, we divide and conquer on some tasks, and given that Alila has no interest in flying, it's quite a treat when she helps with removing covers and tie-downs and helping to get the cabin prepared. While she was doing this though, I was busy starting to have a little bit of a panic attack. Now through flight school, we all learned to do our walk around, and we always discussed the hypothetical anomalies that should or would cause extra investigation. But I would wager that few of us either A, experience an anomaly that would require a follow-up and get that experience, or B, stay vigilant enough after we're certificated that we don't get lazy and develop an expectation bias on our walk-around that it's always going to be okay. Well, I'm happy to report that I did recognize an anomaly almost immediately, but I didn't know why I was experiencing one. I went through a dozen different emotions about the various what-ifs that ran through my head. But when I sampled the left wing, and the inevitable few drops got onto my hand, I felt very greasy, and I knew that wasn't right. 100 low lead is solvent-based and should have felt evaporative and dry to the touch. My first thought is that I was misfueled with Jet A. Jet A has that diesel kerosene kind of greasy residue feel. But as I continued to sample, I could see pure avgas color every time. Opening the fillers, it was a very consistent color and odor. So why am I so greasy? Well, luckily I've been recording my flights to share with all of you, so I thought I could confirm my fuel since the truck came up and filled us up when we landed. I hadn't really looked particularly close at the label on the truck as I should have, but I didn't really recall seeing a black tag either. So I dismounted the GoPro and reviewed the footage, and sure enough, 100 low lead, red tag right there. So fuel contamination is a decreasing source of this particular texture. Now, long story short, and in between apologizing to my wife a few dozen times for being panicked on display for her right before we departed, I realized that only a few hours earlier, we were rolling tea leaves. Now, one thing you may not know is that rolling leaves for an hour is done on purpose to extract oils from the plant to be oxidized. Now, in spite of washing my hands several times since we had done this work, the oil was very much soaked into my skin, and the solvent nature of the avgas extracted that back to the surface of my skin and created that greasy feel. But this isn't really how tea leaves saved my engine yet. After all, I haven't even started it up yet, and there's not been any risk, so it's only strike one. I say strike one because many pilots operate on some variation of a 3 strikes rule. If you get 3 anomalous events that happen during a pre-flight, they'll scrub a flight. And broadly speaking, I follow a similar rule. But what I definitely need to do is amend this to also address the severity of an anomaly. Thinking I was misfueled was a major distraction from my standard setup procedures. As we got started up, we discussed the symptoms of a misfueled plane and what we would do if anything started to behave strangely. My wife agreed to help me play the "where would we go now if we lost the engine" game, and we talked about how even though we checked the footage, it might be possible still that there was something wrong with the fuel, and it might take a little while to show up since we had a relatively high percentage of known good avgas in the mix. When we finished this, we called up for our IFR clearance and started our taxi to the other side of the airport. In all the commotion, one thing I failed to do was enter my flight plan into the GPS. I didn't even realize this until I was switched over to departure on climb out, and they gave me a direct side-on instruction.
371 Bravo Golf, Jack's departure radar contact, climb maintain 10,000, turn to the left or exciting.
I reached down to go direct to, and this is only strike 2, but I'm already in the air. And I really need to reinforce my standard operating procedures to not do this again. But luckily, our flat plan was only 4 total waypoints, and I was able to get direct to where I needed to be and build the flight plan on the go. Again, pretty major mistake, but it still doesn't really account for how tea leaves saved my engine. Let's get into that part. So let's go back a moment and talk about what the symptoms of Jet A getting into a gasoline engine are. Well, that all depends, and if you have a high mix of Jet A versus avgas, you might really struggle to get the thing to run in the first place. But if it's a high percentage of avgas compared to Jet A, you may not even notice at first until higher amounts of that Jet A reach the engine, and that's usually well after takeoff. Now, Jet A burns at a much higher temperature than gasoline, which means that the engine will start to see some runaway temperatures in the cylinders. Again, depending on the mix, this could creep up on you, or it can happen very, very quickly. Now, with this in mind, I had a second round of panic when, during our climb and passing around 10,000 feet, my CHTs started to do this. Now, seeing yellow CHTs means I immediately had to take some level of action, or my engine would be giving up the ghost pretty darn soon. And so I leveled out my climb, pulled some power while ensuring I was still full rich for the cooling effect of the gas, and notified ATC that I needed to address some high temps before continuing my climb. Now, as quickly as I realized my temps were high, my memory items kicked in, and I began kicking myself. The plane was out in the ramp in 105 plus degree temperatures for the entire sunny day, which means my big Continental engine was just experiencing a little bit of the southern vapors. Kicked on the vapor suppression, which is really just a low-pressure fuel pump to get some of that air out of the fuel, and within a few seconds, the temperatures were back in the green, and I was able to continue up to our planned altitude. And here is where I credit those tea leaves for saving my engine. Expectation bias that things will be normal is a very powerful thing. And on any average flight, I would guess that I'm not as consistent in checking my MFD gauges as I was today. Having briefed the symptoms of a misfueled engine means I was watching those gauges way closer than normal. And those tea oils that made themselves known during my fuel sump definitely saved my engine from melting. Now, I didn't really get that close to redline temperatures, but left unchecked, it's very probable that they may have continued to climb. If that were to happen, our $350 fuel bill may have escalated to a 5 or 6 figure repair bill. The rest of our flight home was as uneventful as the flight down, except for the inevitable 10 knots of headwind because it was a homebound leg. I even had a beautiful night landing back in Chicago. Unfortunately, an added side effect of the pre-flight distraction means that I failed to plug in the camera to ship's power, and we only caught the first hour or so of the flight on video. But the departure segment gave me plenty to ponder for updates to my personal standard operating procedures. Now with that, if you made it this far, I'd like to ask for some additional interaction down below with those like and subscribe buttons. And if you're feeling like sharing, leave a comment and let me know of a time when you ended up facing off against expectation bias yourself, and if you managed to catch it. Or, on the flip side, if that bias bit back and left you with a sticky situation. But until the next one, thanks for watching.